Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. We hope you enjoy the program as much as we enjoy presenting it.
And good evening, everybody. I'm Bob Mader. I'm here to host this month's Mentor Live, and we're very, very happy to have Mike Adams, Senior Vice President of Underwriting for our insurance sponsor, Avemco. Welcome, Mike.
Hello, Bob.
So Mike is an instrument-rated private pilot, 30 years experience underwriting aviation risk. Avemco is the only provider of general aviation insurance for over 50 years. A++ superior by AM Best and consecutive years since 1977. I'm very impressed by that. Mike, it's really good to have you. Been a while since I've seen you, and always enjoy talking to you.
All right, well, thank you, Bob.
So, your show? Let's go.
All right, I just want to make one quick correction. We're the only direct provider of general aviation insurance. Yeah, I'm sure that my 14 competitors would take umbrage at thinking I was the only insurance company out there.
Did I miss the word direct? I apologize. The only direct provider.
Perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get into the program here this evening? So if we can move on to the next slide here. And what this is a little bit of an outline for everyone. It's going to be 3 scenarios, and I've got a fourth that I picked up when I was in Minnesota that I'm going to pass on at the end of the program. And it's about, well, no one is injured in any of these accidents. We all learned a lot on it. I'm involved in one of the scenarios. In fact, I'm the pilot in this first scenario. And what it involved is, as you can see on the chart there in the screen, it's a trip from Billings, Montana over to Hillsboro, Oregon. And Hillsboro is where I learned to fly, did the majority of my flying before I got transferred back to our home office in Frederick, Maryland. So if you look at the chart, you can see on the red line there, we got Billings. And then immediately we launch into some of the higher ranges of the Rockies there. And if we move on to the next slide as we progress westbound on this trip, you can see we finally, once we get into eastern Washington and along the Columbia River there, get into some territory that's a little less inhospitable than what we'd been over before. And in fact, if anyone's had the opportunity of flying out in Oregon or the Columbia River Gorge with Multnomah Falls and all, it's really quite lovely once you get along there and you have Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, Mount Hood as landmarks. And then finally you get to cross over Portland, and the last obstacles you have to clear are some communications towers on the top of the West Hills of Portland, and then it's a nice landing into Hillsboro. But it's kind of a long leg. It's not too long for most 182s. So just kind of an overview on this next slide, as you can see how far it is as we dial back, and it goes quite some distance there. Now the flight plan, and I'd make this trip several times with business travel. The flight plan is that, well, if you're in a standard tank 182, Cessna 182P, which is what I was flying, it has 56 gallons of usable fuel. As a crow flies, we've got 603 nautical miles. And from prior experience, I thought, well, we'd be about 4 hours and 20 minutes of flight time. And I thought I'd burn about 12.2 gallons per hour. Interesting note on that 12.2 gallons an hour. If I'd said, well, I think I'm going to burn about 13, you'd say, well, Mike's doing an estimate. But I've got a decimal point in there, and so I've just convinced myself, and probably you, that this is a pretty darn accurate number. And that's what I'm going to get in my performance. So if I play this game of mathematics, I've got a total fuel burn of about 52 gallons, which is going to leave me maybe 4 gallons, which, depending upon how you stretch it out, is 20 to 30 minutes. So I could barely make my fuel reserves or my 30 minutes once I got to the destination airport. Of course, I could always cheat and say, well, I really only wanted to go to Troutdale, which is about 40 miles east of Hillsboro, and say that was my destination. And oh, look, I've got extra fuel, so now I can go on to the next airport, which is always a bad plan. But if we move on to the next slide, we can take a look at a couple of the other factors out here. One is I've got a bit of a conflict here between what I want, and I've had the pleasure of working with one person, Dr. Bill Rhodes, who said, hope is not a plan. So I've got the hope in my mind that I've got enough fuel to get my 30 minutes reserve, or maybe 20, who's counting. But when I go to the pilot operating handbook and I take a look at this airplane, and I'll be flying at 10,500 feet. It'll get me through most of the passes through there and keep me fairly cool on the temperature. It says I've certainly got the hour time to make it, 5.1 hours, but I'm going to be short a little bit on the distance. So I've got a little bit of a dilemma, and this is where we pilots start to get into trouble. I can come up with a rationalization that says, well, I'm going to be departing Billings, which I think is about 3,000 foot MSL at that airport. And I'm landing back at Hillsboro, which is just a mere 245 feet or something. So I can say I'm going downhill the majority of the trip, and therefore I'm going to get a little bit better distance, less fuel burn out of that. So I've got one thing that says I've got the time endurance, but I can't make the time. So what do? Well, let's move on to the next slide and see what Mike tries to figure out for this dilemma. Well, a couple of things on there is that, one, this was a business trip. I'd actually was coming back from an FAA safety fly-in out there. I had some business promotional materials out there, some handouts, some business cards and things. Had a little cardboard traveling display for the show that you put up on a tabletop. Had a week's worth of clothes, which generally consisted of a whole lot of company polo shirts, a couple of pairs of Dockers, and a couple of pairs of shoes. And then I always traveled with an emergency kit, because if something were to go wrong in Western Montana or even Eastern Washington and Oregon, you'd want to have something out there to give you a little bit of protection or help. The other aspect on it is I had a half case of oil. And I always thought that the flight school that I was renting that airplane from was telling me something about the engine. Well, I don't know how many of you in the audience have flown 182s, but the old rule is if you got a little extra weight in the baggage compartment, your landing flares a lot easier and a lot smoother. And they finally admitted to me that, yeah, Mike, we've seen some of your landings, so you're always going to fly with that half case of oil. So that's what I had inside the airplane for the trip. So a couple other things that didn't come up, and let's move on to the next slide here, is my rationalization and stuff as well. I'm not heavily loaded, higher is better, get a little bit more endurance. Winds, generally if the weather's VFR, which this was, you're going to have some slight winds out of the west. And if you get up into the jet stream, as you know, any of you that have flown from the East Coast to the West Coast and then had to return, you get home a lot faster than you do going out west. A little bit of a issue on this was some sightseeing. This route took me near Yellowstone National Park. Jackson Hole, Wyoming was going to be off to my left. Glacier National Park was off to my right. Then you had the Columbia River Gorge, Mount Hood, and all of that. So would I be exactly on that magenta line that I traced out on a chart? Probably not. So I've got a little extra distance in there. And then this particular trip had an external pressure. And the Kings talk about external pressure and what that does to a pilot and how you make a decision. When I rent this airplane for travel, I have to leave a pretty detailed itinerary of where I'm going, what nights I'll be at what airports and things, so the flight school knows where I am, where I should be, and can track me down at any time. Well, about 3 days into the trip, now this was a depart Monday, planned to get home Friday afternoon, late afternoon. And about halfway through the trip, I got a call from the flight school that said, say, are you still planning to be back on Friday? And I said, yeah, that's still the plan. My last meeting actually isn't over until Thursday evening, but yeah, Friday I'll be home for sure. And they said, well, do you think you could make it by noon? I said, well, why is that? And he says, well, we have another guy that's been a good customer and he wants to rent it about 1 o'clock to take it for a weekend. And he's going to put at least 15 hours on that plane for us, and that's revenue to a flight school. No offense to any flight schools that are listening there. So like a pilot, and we're always trained that, yes, we can do anything that's asked because we have skill and steel nerves. As I said, sure, I can do that. I can go ahead and make it back because I was ready to be through with the trip, honestly. I'd been gone for a while, had a couple of young kids. My wife was by herself that week. So I said, yep, I'm going to get up bright and early, and I think I can make it nonstop. So let's move on to the next slide here for the next talk. Well, I learned a couple of things, and I'm going to drag this out before I give you the end of how this trip ended, is I learned several things on that trip that were critical to all my future flying and survival and being here. is you got to have some self-discipline. And I think that's something that all of us pilots and aviators have heard about. It's very easy to talk about, but it's very difficult to actually enforce on yourself, particularly when there aren't any witnesses. So you got to have the self-discipline and set some objectives. You always land with 1 hour of fuel remaining now. That 30 minutes, that's not enough. I always want to stop at least halfway through the trip, but as long as I'm not flying more than 3 hours. When you make a 4 hour or a 5 hour leg, generally the landings are absolutely horrible. It takes you a while to get out of the airplane and you're fatigued. You're breathing air at 10,500 feet, which is a little bit higher than most of us usually hang out. You've got the constant din of the airplane. You've got some heat and temperature issues. So you're just not in good shape. If you're going to land for gas, which is something else on this leg that I found out, you got to get the gas. If you plan that flight stop to pick up fuel, once you've got there, you can't suddenly recalculate and say, hey, guess what? I have enough fuel to make it to my destination. Now, you may have enough fuel to get somewhere, but it probably won't be to where you wanted to get fuel. So you need to plan for the unplannable, and then you need to take into effect the altitude, temperature, and turbulence. And of course, we all get our pilot operating handbook and our charts, and we do our altitude calculations and our temperature and our turbulence to see how it's going to affect the performance of the airplane. And what I'm really talking about is how is it going to affect the performance of us as pilots. Altitude is going to affect us adversely, temperature is going to affect us adversely, and turbulence is going to affect us adversely. So if you've got those three things piled on with a long trip, you're working up to a rather less than desirable termination of your trip. So let's move on to the next slide here. And I want to talk a little bit about the FARs. We all know what they are: 30 minutes in daylight, 45 minutes after dusk, a little bit longer if you're on a flight plan with your IFR plan with your alternate filed. Helicopters have something different. We can recite them chapter and verse. Every flight review we have, the CFI probably asks you that question because they want to throw you a bone that you can easily pass. You know, you got to get one in the win column there. So we do have that, but do we ever really fly like that? Now I'd like to move on to the next slide with that. And I want to talk about unexpected diversions that come in with this 30-minute reserve or 45-minute reserve. What we've got up there is a nice outline of the Pacific Northwest. In the upper left-hand corner, about halfway down, we've got the tip of Washington. You can see kind of a jagged line that moves from east to west, takes a dip south, the lower part of the map. That's actually the border of Oregon and Washington, and where the river heads south and then it heads west again. That's about where Portland, Oregon is. That's the Willamette Valley. And this is a January photo, so you can see the little white dots there that are just to the left of the clouds there. That's probably Mount Adams, Mount St. Helens, and Mount Hood in there, and maybe Jefferson down on the southern point. It's nicely clear in Portland this day, which is rather surprising because if you look a little bit south, then the Willamette Valley is generally notorious for some fog in the winter and low-flying clouds with a nice marine layer of air and a nice drizzle that makes it such a great agricultural area for the farmers. Makes it horrible for a lot of VFR flying, but it's nice for the farmers. So you got to plan for lousy weather. This one was unusually nice, so we'll accept that. But then other things as we move on to the next slide that we can take a look at is the unexpected diversions of fuel, no fuel, and carrying cash. I have a little story that is related somewhat to this. I was on a different trip and I was out in eastern Washington, and this falls in the line that you can't believe everything you read on the internet, nor can you believe everything you see in the print. I had scheduled to buy some fuel at a small airport out in eastern Washington that was reported as having fuel, and it was right, halfway through a trip, perfect where I needed to get it. So when I landed there, true enough, it had fuel, which is good. And yes, they were willing to sell it to me. What I didn't know at the time when I was planning the trip is that the fuel was really intended for the local aerial applicator that was also the manager of the airport. But because he was the manager of the airport, he had to make fuel available, and he did it on a cash basis. So if you're traveling and expecting to use a credit card in all places, you need some cash for fuel. Fortunately, in that case, I did have enough money to buy about 5 gallons. That got me onto the 30-minute reserve to another place that would take a credit card for fuel. So if you're planning long trips or you're going to have some fuel stops, it wouldn't hurt to have at least one tank full of fuel and cash on hand. And if you run out of fuel, if you hit the next button there, if it's empty, again, you can't recalculate and decide that you've suddenly got enough fuel to go somewhere else. It doesn't work. We read about those accidents all the time where someone landed. Actually, we had a situation out in the Oregon area for, again, people there. There's a fellow that owned a Bonanza. He took it over to Pearson Air Park in Vancouver, Washington for its annual. He was based out of Sandy, Oregon. And when he went to pick up the airplane, the fuel taxes in Vancouver were higher than what he was paying over at Sandy because he got a local discount. And so he said, well, I've got enough fuel to make it back to Sandy, and I'll tanker up at that point. Unfortunately, he got within about 5 miles of the airport, had an off-airport landing that went extremely poorly, and he ended up dying by saving about 20 cents a gallon on fuel. So if you need the gas to get somewhere, make sure you get the gas there one way or another before you move on. Speaking of moving on, let's have the next slide. Okay, again, unexpected diversions, closed runways. I don't know the relative age of all of us here, but some of us probably remember when Bill Clinton got a haircut out in Los Angeles and how it kind of shut down an airport. We don't have that situation very often in general aviation, but we can have other closed runways that come up rather quickly. And one of them was caused by a customer of mine. This was out in Aurora, Oregon, which is the south of Portland. And he was flying his Piper Arrow. He was up in the pattern, doing some touch and goes to stay current. And Aurora is a very busy flight school area. And so there were 3 or 4 students in their 150s and Cherokees and Skyhawks up doing touch and goes also. Winds were a little bit out of the south, so they were all landing to the south in a right-hand pattern. And then a 210 was flying up from southern Oregon. Nothing against Cessna 210s or their pilots, but Barry Schiff wrote an interesting article that said, you know, it's not illegal or necessarily wrong to call it a straight-in at a non-controlled airport. Caused a lot of controversy, but, you know, good discussion is good. Well, anyway, the Cessna 210 pilot did call a straight in from the south. The student pilots quickly cleared out because that's what they'd been instructed to do. My customer, and you know how this story is going to end, my customer was on final, keyed up the mic, started to chew on the 210 pilot, started to execute the go around, retracted the gear, chewed on the pilot a little bit more. The 210 landed, got off the airport. Before the students got back into the pattern, my pilot had gone around and landed gear up. Forgot to hit the checklist again. So now we've got 3 students that are either immediately cleared for solo to land somewhere else that isn't endorsed in their logbook, or they had to have enough fuel to continue to circle until they landed. Fortunately, they all had enough fuel. The local FBO was pretty quick to run out there, lift up the arrow, drop the gear, and push it off the runway so that the students could come in and land. But that is a classic example of how you think you have plenty of fuel and you may not because of someone else's actions.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump in here.
Sure.
A couple of things. First, I like that story about closing a runway. And since Oshkosh is coming up in a few days, there are a lot of our members that fly to the show. And one of my rules, and this is Bob educating everybody, but one of my rules for flying into Oshkosh is I stop short somewhere, Janesville or Madison or something like that, and I top off. And that paid off about 6 years ago when the controllers at Fisk came on and said, okay, everybody pick a silo and start circling because we just had the runways closed because somebody had geared up at Oshkosh.
Yep.
So, and we wound up circling for about an hour before they could straighten everything out. A member had a question. What's the best tool to use to check on fuel availability? I'll give you my opinion. What you have to say. There are a lot of good tools out there on the internet. SkyVector, of course, ForeFlight has the fuel prices and availability. AirMap is another tool on the internet. I'm sure I don't use the Garmin product personally, but I'm sure Garmin has the same type of thing. But to me, is once you've done a little bit of research, the best tool is your phone. Dial ahead.
Absolutely.
Doesn't take but a second. What do you think?
Oh yeah, no, the phone is the ultimate way to determine that there's going to be fuel there. And it also will let you know if someone's going to be there to dispense it if it's not a self-fueling facility.
Great point. Great point. Nothing like landing in the evening and you see the pump locked up, and now what?
Well, that's when you make that decision. Do I want to pay that after-hour fee, or do I want to go into town and spend the night?
Yeah. I mean, that's never happened to me. Not once, not ever. Anyway, continuing on.
Good. So that's an example of unexpected diversions, closed runways. And if we look at the next slide here, communications are kind of important out there. And this is a pretty quick segue from the gear up to talking to ATC. Let me dispel the myth that talking to AC will add more fuel to your plane. It does not. But there are a couple things that probably a lot of us pilots have forgotten about since we did some of our initial check rides and things. And the magic words of minimum fuel and an emergency. If you were to say minimum fuel, you're putting ATC, if you're in contact with ATC, on notice that you're getting down to where you may be declaring an emergency fairly soon. And if they're on the ball, they'll start to expedite you to your destination or to an area, give you directions to where you can get within your fuel range. If you declare minimum fuel, you don't have to fill out any paperwork as far as I know, because you haven't declared an emergency. You're just put a notice out there. You haven't really admitted any wrongdoing on it. And again, you've got the ATC queued up to, if you do have to call an emergency, then they're already pre-loaded in that to help you out. And then at that point, you are into some paperwork, but I'll tell you, paperwork with the FAA is probably the less pain. Well, I've never done paperwork much with the FAA. I've done a fair amount of insurance claim paperwork, and I can tell you that's relatively painful. We try and make it as easy as we can, but it may be easier to deal with an emergency and land safely than to have to deal with all of the problems of off-airport landing or any kind of a claim or a suit back against you. And at this point, when we talk about fuel, I usually say, well, you ought to fly like a professional. But if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to give you an example of when you may not want to. And that's, you always want to have plan B when it comes to fuel. And that's something that Avianca Flight 52 didn't really have. And I'll give you a quick thumbnail of this. It's an interesting read. The synopsis is quite good. But basically, it was a flight out of Columbia into JFK. And during the course of the flight, they had 3 separate holes. And those holes totaled 1 hour and 17 minutes. And then there were other delays getting in, and the weather was marginal. And by the time the flight crew got around to, they thought they had told the controllers that they were having a fuel emergency or on minimum fuel. The controllers and the tape never really heard that. So there was some miscommunication there. But this was where the jet on its first go around on the missed approach ran out of fuel and crashed. I believe there were like 73 deceased souls on board that. But it is very critical that if you do get into a situation where you think you might have minimum fuel, you ought to go ahead and declare that. And if you think you're going to get into an emergency, you ought to go ahead and declare that too. The Pride is easy to repair. All the other stuff is difficult if you have an engine out in an off field. So enough on that. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and before I talk about this, I'll go ahead and give you the cliffhanger on my trip to Hillsboro, Oregon. That was kind of a red herring. I was flying a 182 that had 75 usable gallons. So I was able to make the trip nonstop, but there were times when I didn't have that plane available, and I was sorely tempted to try and make some of the legs a little bit longer than they should have been. But fortunately, I never got caught out on it. So that's the end of that story on there. Again, the self-discipline, external pressures, make sure you have the fuel. So let's move on to scenario number 2 here. Yeah, Bob.
Mike, can I hold you up for 1 second? Just one other thing that I like to tell my students is remember what kind of pilots got the numbers in those books. and what kind of airplanes. Brand new, perfectly broken in, and they're test pilots. And they have one other job, to sell airplanes. So I always make sure, I tell my students 20%. Pad everything by 20%. That way they won't be talking to you or the FAA.
All right. Well, keep that thought, because when we get to the third scenario, this might come up again. You're perfectly. You don't need to apologize at all. Okay. But back to the tourama of the Pacific Northwest here. On May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, and it was spectacular. I was out in southeast Portland. I wasn't flying at the time, but I was up on quite a high hill and had a very good view of it once I heard the news that the mountain had erupted. So Mount St. Helens was an interesting attraction for us aviators before it erupted. And after it erupted, it was just like catnip for us. We couldn't stay away from it. And it was one of our favorite destinations if we wanted to introduce our non-aviator friends to aviation. It was a great sightseeing trip, just long enough, great scenery, etc. And so if we move on to the next slide, I'll tell you how we generally did this if we were flying out of Hillsboro. First off, though, I want to set it. This is another Cessna 182 story. No, I was not the pilot in this case. I do know who the pilot is. So it was a pilot plus 3 friends. He had about 18 gallons in each tank. Overall, it's about 100 nautical miles, about an hour and a half flight. And the aircraft was within gross takeoff weight and the center of gravity. So everything was legal. Now, for those of you that are looking at the picture and you're saying that's an awful odd looking 182 wing, you're absolutely correct. That's belongs to a Piper Warrior that my father-in-law owned. And we took this picture on one of the times we went up to look at St. Helens after it had erupted. And for all of you that fly Cherokees, you do realize that if you have low fuel in the one wing and you make that the low wing so your passengers can take pictures, if you do it long enough, you're going to onport the fuel and your engine's going to cough and everyone's going to get real excited. So make sure you don't slip that plane too long. Tell them to take pictures over the wing. So anyway, back to the 182 story here for a minute. The next slide will have the chart and you can see how we flew this. Okay, we flew out of Hillsboro on there, which is at the bottom of that little dog leg. And we could have gone direct and we would have been talking to Portland departure or approach. And usually they would clear us right through that airspace for a direct line to Mount St. Helens. But then we found out that, you know, our passengers, the non-aviators, generally got pretty excited when they looked out the right or left window, whether you're going north or south, to see an airliner flying what they thought was directly at them on a kamikaze course. So we generally did the dog leg, stay out of the Portland territory, let them see the Columbia River, parts of Vancouver on up to Mount St. Helens. And then you'd do a couple of circles up there, take your pictures, and then you would come back. So, you know, it was a climb up and out and a trip back. Now, what happened on this? Let's go on to the next slide. It's a prettier picture. And we'll just leave this up for the rest of the story. That's the Mount St. Helens looking from the south, I believe. It's not the crater side. But what happened in this flight is the pilot took off, they flew up, made the trip, they were coming back, and one of the passengers lived in Tigard, Oregon, which is southwest of Portland, just a suburb of it, and said, well, hey, do you think you could fly over my house? Well, other than flying over Mount St. Helens, what do we pilots like to do when we have non-aviators in the airplane? We like to go show them their house or their work or wherever they are. So this pilot said, sure, we can do that. He was mentally making notes about how much fuel he should have burned, how the tanks should read, how the gauges, where they'd been. And so they went out over Tigard. Now, the thing that makes this kind of a happy ending is that he had a rule that anytime he was over a populated area, he would not go below an altitude at which if he lost the engine, he couldn't safely glide to an unpopulated area. And the Portland, Oregon and Tigard area has some pretty strict urban growth boundaries. So he was able to pick an altitude to go over and look at the house and see what all was going on. And still, if something happened, he could still make it to a farm field. Well, as it turned out, after they'd found the house and they were then beginning to head back to Hillsboro, the airplane suddenly got real quiet. So after switching tanks and the engine still staying quiet, they declared an emergency and landed off airport in what was fortunately a freshly harvested hayfield that had been in the dry season, so it was a nice hard surface. He'd been in touch with Portland Control there and also the Hillsboro Towers, so they had that notice that they're declaring an emergency, going to have an off-airport landing, which was picked up by the local police and the news stations, and this happened during drive time in the morning, mind you. The news stations monitored the local police channels, and so they heard about it too. So by the time I'd gotten to the office, my assistant, this is when I had the office in Portland, Oregon, my assistant had already said, "Hey, did you hear about that plane landing outside of Tigard?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." Well, following up on it, I got a chance to talk to the pilot. And if we go on to the next slide, the couple of lessons that come out of this are very critical. And the thing that he said that had I written the time and fuel, which I normally do, this would not have happened. But I didn't write it down. I thought it was going to be an easy flight. I was doing the mental calculations. And so even though something in the back of my mind was telling me this doesn't look quite right, my calculations, because I couldn't remember exactly what I thought before, said it was okay. And as it turned out, what happened was he was interrupted during the pre-flight inspection. And it was when he was checking the fuel in the left tank. So one of the faults we pilots have is when we get a question about an airplane, we love to tell the people all about it. So he got distracted with that. And on the 182, they've got those flush caps, and it didn't get all the way in. It was slightly ajar, but not so much that you would see it when you did a quick walk around and looked over the wing. This was an older model, and it had the old bladder tank. And what ultimately happened is he flew the first half of the plane out of the right tank, and the left tank started reading half full and just stayed at half full all the time, which didn't seem quite right. Well, what had happened is that the fuel had been siphoned continuously out of the left tank, and that's tough to see on a low wing plane, almost impossible on a high wing plane. And then what happened, as it turned out in talking to the mechanic, is there is enough suction there that the bottom of the bladder sucked up so that it was pushing against the fuel gauge. And that's why it read half full until it stopped flying. Then, of course, the bladder had no vacuum on it, and it fell down and it showed empty. So he said he would have known something was wrong had he written down the time and fuel on that to know that he shouldn't have had that much fuel in the left tank that continuously after switching over to it from the right tank on the descent. The other thing that he said was, I just said, is that when you get interrupted in the pre-flight, you start the whole thing over. He not only said, I don't just back up a step, I'm going to start over and make sure I have it absolutely right.
That's great advice. Or you just tell people, we'll talk when I'm done. One of the two. Coincidentally, one of the viewers, Barry, asked, when in cruise, what's the best way to account for variables in wind, temperature, and so on against your fuel burn? And you brought it up before I even had a chance to ask, is do your fuel checks. How much fuel have I burned? How does it look? I've heard it called in the military a how's it going chart. And basically, I should have burned this much. The gauges should be saying this much. How's it look? And if it, in this case, if it looks magical, there's probably something broken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is magical, not in the good way.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's go on to the third story here, Bob. And this is where we'll come back with the earlier question and comment you had. This is, and I don't charge extra for these tours that I'm giving you through the Pacific Northwest, by the way. This here's a picture of the Three Sisters in the Three Sisters Wilderness area. They're out right now, currently inactive volcanoes. The North Sister is on the left. The Middle Sister is obviously in the middle. And on the right is the South Sister. In July, there's probably several youth groups up there that use that area as a high adventure camp for it, Girl Scouts, camp, Boy Scouts, etc. The flight schools in the Willamette Valley, at least the flight school I flew in up in Hillsboro, love those things because they're great NAVAids for student solo cross countries. I mean, if you can see those mountains, you know exactly where you are. If you can't see them, you're in the clouds and you ought to be somewhere else if you're a VFR pilot, or you're going the wrong direction. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll show you the chart of, well, let's see, let's talk about the airplane first. Then I'll show you the chart that the student should have flown. This accident occurred in a Cessna 150. It had the 22.5 gallon tank. So if we look at the charts at 7,000 feet, we've got about 340 nautical miles, 3.3 hours. And again, that's with the takeoff, climb, and then 30 minutes at 45% power type thing. And this is where I usually ask a question of how many of us have actually gone out and said, okay, I think I've got 30 minutes of fuel. I'm going to cut back to 45 power and see how far I can get. It's the most excruciating, long, boring, tense-filled 30 minutes you'll probably ever have because you're not going anywhere fast at all. So it's almost kind of prolonging the inevitable. But back to the 150, if the student had climbed up to 10,000 feet, they can now stretch it to 420 nautical miles and they get about 4.9 hours. Okay, so now we can move on to the chart and let's talk about the route and some altitudes and all. Okay, here's the chart. This is Oregon, the top of the triangle there at the top, that's Hillsboro. And generally the students would take their first leg and they'd go from Hillsboro over to Redmond, Oregon. And the thing that was nice about that is if you kept Mount Hood on your left wing and you kept Mount Jefferson on your right wing, you would eventually hit a highway that you could either turn left, and if you came to the Columbia River, you immediately had to land because you were terribly lost, or if you turned right and you still hadn't found Redmond, you would eventually get to Redmond because it's right on the highway there, a nice big airport that has a lot of fire bombers based at it during the summer periodically. So in Redmond, you would then set off in your next leg. You're on the dry side or the east side of the Oregon Cascades. And at this point, the Three Sisters are going to be on your right wing because you're flying south, and you'd head down to Medford. So you'd get a chance to see Crater Lake off to the side, Klamath Lake a little further down. You'd see the Three Sisters. You finally land in Medford. And then from Medford, you could get in your IFR practice, which was the I follow roads, because essentially you could fly right up Interstate 5 and it would take you almost right into Hillsboro. So it was a nice, safe cross country for students, a lot of nice scenery, a lot of good landmarks on it. But if we look at the legs, you can see we've got 109 nautical miles on the first leg, 136, and I'm not wearing my spectacles here, so I think that's 136. And then we have 190 on the end. So even at 10,000 feet, we know we're going to have to stop for fuel. So the instructor did a good job and did talk to the student about refueling. Now, we'll do the virtual hand hold up here. How many of you think the instructor told the student that they needed to buy fuel in Redmond? Hopefully there's no hands. How many of you think he told him to buy fuel in Medford? Everyone's hand should go up. Where do you think the student purchased fuel on the trip? Everyone should be saying Redmond, because yes, that's exactly what the student pilot did. They knew they had to buy fuel. They stopped and they bought fuel. We all remember our first long solo cross country. You're nervous as heck. You know, you got your things written down, but you're still kind of terrified by it all. So we bought fuel there. And on the leg from Redmond down to Medford, again, enjoying the Three Sisters off on the right and Crater Lake down off of the nose a little bit, said, I might not have bought fuel in the right place. I'm not sure what I should do on this. So when he landed in Medford, he got out the pilot operating handbook. And he did the calculation. He said, well, okay, let's see. I kind of came across that maybe 8,500 from Redmond down to Medford. So that's about 7,000. So, you know, a pretty decent fuel burn there. And I'm going to probably go about 7,000 feet to get back to Portland, because it gets me high enough where I can see where I'm going, and it gets me out of a lot of other traffic type things. So in doing the pilot operating handbook, if we add up the 136 and 190, we get 426 nautical miles. And it says, we should be able to, we get 300. I can do the math here, excuse me. We've got enough in the pilot operating handbook, and let me go back and refresh my memory on that, to make the distance out there, actually on there. So he says, I'm going to go ahead and go for it. So here's where we start the next time of the hand holding up. When he didn't buy fuel in Medford. So along about the time it starts to get where fuel might be a little bit critical, we're over at Eugene, and Eugene is that bright yellow dot just below the 190 mark. And then from Eugene, he passes a series of airports that are all along I-5 or not too far off. He goes near Corvallis, Oregon, and then near Lebanon, Oregon, both of which have fuel and nice runways. And then from Lebanon, you get to Independence, Oregon. From Independence, the next stop would be Salem, Oregon, state capital of Oregon, by the way. And then from Salem, you can go on to Newburgh. Now, if you're at Newburgh, you're not too far up to McMinnville, where the Evergreen Air Museum used to be. And then from there on, you can go to Aurora, where that gear up accident closed the runway. Again, it's not too far out of the way. And then finally, if you're really pushing it, you can get to Twin Oaks Air Park, which is just south of Hillsboro. And then you can push on to Hillsboro. So he flew by quite a few airports that had fuel on it. But again, the pilot operating handbook said that he should have been able to make that. He didn't get to the airport. He got awful close. He got within 3 miles of the airport. Unfortunately, the 3 mile mark south of the airport put him in the trees in the middle of a city park. And it took him about 3 hours to get the pilot extricated from the plane and out of the trees, and a little bit longer for the airplane. Needless to say, a little more negative press for the aviation in the area, a little bit of a black eye on it. Well, this attracts the attention of the FAA, as well it should. And now this next part that I'm going to tell you, I heard third hand, so take it with a grain of salt. The candidate, the student on the solo, was grilled extensively on what they did wrong. And once they pulled out all the calculations, showed that they knew how to control the mixture on the airplane, did the temperature, the forecast winds, etc., everything. The FAA, the examiners had to say, yeah, basically, you took off on a plane where you had all the information, you had enough fuel to get to your destination, you had 30 minutes reserve, according to the pilot operating handbook. So then they said, well, now the problem must be with the instructor. So they sat down with the instructor and grilled the instructor extensively on it. And at the end of the day, pretty much had to say, well, everyone did everything exactly right. And there's not much else we can do here, because the flight school actually had it written in their procedures, in the checklist of the pre-solo, is that you purchase fuel in Medford. And so on the pre-flight checklist, the pre-trip checklist, the instructor had in their separate records, not just notes in the logbook, but separate records, showed that, yes, we briefed buying fuel in Medford and not in Redmond. And the fact that the student purchased it in Redmond was beyond the instructor's control. So we end up with a student that, quite honestly, I don't know if they ever finished their flight training after that. We did lose an airplane out of the fleet. It was a constructive total loss. But again, it's, as you brought up earlier, Bob, it's one of those things where the pilot operating handbook said he should have made it. So what do you do as an instructor? And before I give you a chance to answer, let's move on to the next slide, and I'll hit a couple points that came out of this. So closing thoughts, and then I'll open it up to you, Bob, here in a minute. Let's move on to the next slide here. Is we do have to have your personal minimums. You do have to have ethics when you're flying, and the ethics are, if you've got personal minimums, you don't break them. If you're going to stop for gas, you get the gas, plan for the unplannable. Is your predicted fuel burn accurate? So here's this kind of the dilemma that comes in, what do you do? And the next slide has, I'd like to claim them as original ideas, but if you look at the next slide, these are all things that I copied from everyone else. Don't rely solely on the pilot operating handbook. As Bob, you mentioned, maybe you add 20%. On an older airplane, lower horsepower, it's worn out a little bit. If you own the airplane, check for yourself. Fill it up, fly a specific time, do some maneuvers, come back, tape it off, top it off, measure with a dipstick. Make sure you know exactly what your fuel burn is. You'd be surprised at how different it is between getting a new engine that's a full 150 horsepower in my father-in-law's Cherokee versus the engine that got to 2,300 hours but was still rated at 150 horsepower. The performance was just night and day when you got that new engine in there on the takeoff and the other things. And then, Bob, as you said, add a margin for error. And at this point, I'll give you a chance to make a couple of comments. If you don't, I'll keep going.
Well, the one comment I'd like to make is just thinking about the story about this particular student. They passed a lot of airports. One thing I would counsel all flight instructors is tell your students, yeah, I've endorsed you for this leg for these airports, but if you're getting nervous, land. We can figure it out. It's okay. Let them know that it's okay. I have a saying that I like to use. It's anxiety is nature's way of telling you you've probably already made a big mistake. And so mitigate that. If you're getting anxious, do something about it. The other thing, I want to go back to the timing thing. This is a question from Philip. Since you've flown Pipers a lot, how do you like to measure your fuel? What's your methodology?
Oh, well, let's see. The way I was taught was you look and see where the tab is and how much fuel you think you have up to the tab. And then if you bend over and squint real hard, occasionally you can see one of the corners of the fuel tank, and you should know that you have X amount of fuel if you've got an inch or two above that corner of the fuel tank. Both of those methods, unless the gas is right at the tab, are totally inaccurate. So a dipstick is still the way to go. A calibrated dipstick that is for your airplane, with your airplane being leveled.
Well, and the other thing he brought up was, do you like to go by your watch like every 10 minutes or not 10 minutes, every 30 minutes? 30 minutes and change, or do you go by gallonage? The gauge move 10 gallons and then change, or how do you like to do that in a Piper? Or
Personally, I go by time, because one, that allows me to make sure that my flight calculations have me flying over the territory or hitting the points that I should have hit by a certain time. And that gets back to the earlier question of, if I've flown for half an hour and I'm not at this destination, the winds are different than we're forecast, or I've got a plane that's out of trim, or I'm doing something wrong with the cross control that isn't quite working properly. So I always go by time myself.
Okay. And Teresa Camp brought up a good point, and this is just a comment she made. I'd like your thoughts on it. She's an old friend of mine, but well, she's not old, but you know what I mean. We've known each other.
A long-time friend.
Yeah, bad phrasing, but anyway, she points out, and she's done some air rallies. You really don't know if the airplane's full unless it's coming out of the overflow. I mean, there's air gaps and bubbles and stuff like that.
Yes, there are. In fact, I'm going to interject this one last story here, and I'll make it real quick, and we'll have a little bit more time for questions and answers. This is a story that came up. I made this presentation live at the 2015 Great Minnesota Aviation Gathering. And during the Q&A session at the end, someone said, "Say, do you mind if I add a story to this?" And I said, "No, go right ahead." She says, "Well, it's a true story. It was my husband and I. We own a Piper Meridian. The husband has got an ATP, single engine land, all of that. His wife is a private instrument rated single engine land. And they'd had the Meridian for quite a while. And they had planned a trip up to Alaska. This is, I believe they were based out of Anoka Blaine County in Minnesota. And as it turned out, with the plane loaded, them in it, with the equipment they had to carry to fly through Canada and Alaska with the emergency kits, they couldn't ever take off with full fuel. And this is a story of warning to those of you that say, well, I've got fuel totalizers and all of these, fuel range rings and things, so I'll never have this problem. Well, they had the totalizer and all of that. So where they ended up is the trip went from Minnesota. It was through Canada. They got as far north as Kotzebue, Alaska, which is just south of the Arctic Circle over on the west side. And then they came back down the coast to Bellingham, Washington. And then from Bellingham, Washington, they headed back to Minnesota. Now, the last two legs of the trip were from Kotzebue down to Ketchikan, and then Ketchikan to Bellingham, and then Bellingham, as I said, over to Blaine County. Interestingly enough, flight time for this total trip was 35 hours. So it sounds like an absolutely wonderful trip to me. Total distance they flew was about 7,000 miles. But what it turned out over time, in the essence of her story, was she was kind of the load officer, fuel manager for the trip. And she said, between all of the calculations of gallons to liters to pounds to, imperial gallons, et cetera, and measuring our fuel burn and the fuel flow, et cetera, and resetting the fuel totalizer each time to account for where it was, we thought we had it pretty well dialed in. And they felt pretty comfortable about it. And this is kind of that ignorance is bliss, and they had every right to feel comfortable with what they're doing, but they didn't find out the error factor until they'd landed back at the end of the trip at Anoka. And this is where, and I'm sure all of us as pilots have done this, we've made a trip and then we hang around to make sure we know exactly how much fuel goes in to fill up the plane totally, because we're kind of curious if our calculations were really that accurate. By the time they had finally filled the Meridian up to its full capacity, or as full as they could get it knowingly, they did the calculations and realized that when they landed, they had just 4 gallons of usable fuel left in the plane. Wow. Now that plane burns about 36 to 45 gallons an hour. So that 4 gallons they had left would have got them just off the departure end on a go around. And she said that was just an eye-opening experience with all of the work they put in to try and make sure everything was done correctly and they accounted for factors, but just that small compounding of an error over that 35 hours of flight time resulted in almost a disaster.
I'm very happy that it didn't happen to them, and that reminds me of the, you remember the Gimli glider, right?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Was it a 7.5 or a 7.6? I can't remember which. But it was
it's 7 something.
Yeah, it was liters to gallons to pounds to kilograms conversion, and they ran out of gas and wound up landing on a closed runway, which had been turned into a drag strip. It's anybody who wants to read a good story, look up Gimli glider. It's a good story. Mm-hmm. John, to all of this, John adds that relying on the fuel tanks. I love this statement. I'm going to steal it from him. Relying on the fuel gauges leads to both dry throats and dry tanks.
Thanks. Yes, that is a good one.
Known quantities and a watch are the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I'm stealing it.
Yeah.
Thanks,
all right.
John.
Okay. I think I've got one more slide, and then we'll get back into more questions and answers here just to wrap up. This is a shameless plug for the FAA wings. And incidentally, it's a shameless plug for Avemco Insurance Company. When you complete the wings and you check that box that said, yes, please send me my wings, Avemco is the insurance company that pays for and ships those wings to you. We would like to buy a lot more and ship a lot more wings. So train early and train often, and be sure and apply for the credit.
Hear, hear.
We'll hit the final slide and get back to the questions. It's the question slide.
No, nothing. Don't see anything right now. I will make a comment about, you told the story that the FAA went through everything and found nobody at fault. There was a similar experience at an FBO where I taught several years ago. Somebody planned the trip to Asheville, North or South Carolina? Asheville.
North Carolina.
North Carolina. I was right the first time. Okay, Asheville, North Carolina. And they planned the trip out beautifully in an Archer and everything else. And they landed on the Biltmore estate, just 4 miles short of the airport. And the FAA went through everything. And he showed the POH, the FM actually, and fuel burns and all the calculations. And the inspector for whatever FSDO handles that area said, and you really believe those books? You did everything right. We can't blame you, but nope. Mm-hmm. So word to the wise, we in our little airplanes, we're not really worried about tankering or anything like that. Carrying extra weight, burning fuel to carry fuel. So doesn't hurt. Fill up when you can. Yeah.
Oh, one more story, and this is out in Astoria, Oregon, to the mouth of the Columbia River. Don Sokol was the individual. He ran the FBO out there many, many years ago. He's since retired. And on the wall of the FBO is a picture of a B-17, and the pilot outboard wing was burned off out to the engine. And so I was looking at it one day and said, well, that's an interesting photo. Where'd you get that? And he says, well, that was my plane coming back from a mission. And it was a photo taken by the gunner of another plane in the squadron. And he says, that's one of the only times I've ever felt I've had too much fuel on board, is when that engine lit up. He said, but the good news is that his altitude, as soon as he cut off the fuel, it got so cold, the fire went out and the engine just sat there. Said then our next worry was on 3 engines, we couldn't keep up with everyone else. And as we fell further behind, we were more and more prey to attack. He says, but Fortunately, the protection showed up in time and they did all get back. So he lived a long time to tell the story.
Yeah, well, I'm glad he did. And that is a great point. There's the old saying about runway behind you, fuel in the tank, in the truck, and so on. So always consider that, folks. Somebody brought up a good point about complacency on a short flight. You know, you're flying local, you're in the pattern. What do you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've got some stories on that. One that Mount St. Helens was the classic. The guy says, hey, I've done this all the time. It's an hour and a half. It's essentially a local flight. He didn't write it down. Another situation that came up was where someone was going to take a friend for a ride in their plane and had called for fuel delivery. And it turned out that there was going to be delay in the delivery. And for some reason, the pilot, even though they had called for fuel before they were going to take the flight, suddenly decided that they had enough fuel to do whatever flying they wanted to do. They almost got back to the airport. And unfortunately, it ended up with some minor injuries and a total destruction of the airplane. But again, it's that classic, well, we're just going to be around for a little bit. I really don't have to take a look at anything. And that's what happened. We had a customer that destroyed a Comanche, a PA-24, essentially on the same thing. They went out and said, well, I just thought I'd go do 3 touch and goes. And at least they were honest. They admitted they didn't check the fuel. They looked at the fuel gauge. They thought they had enough from the last trip. They got in 1 takeoff, 1 touch and go. The next one was a full stop landing in a rail yard.
Oh, that's that's not a good place to land.
No, it's not.
No. Wow. Dave offers that we have talked a lot about the cross countries, but he brings up the very point you just brought up. Complacency on a local flight, no problem, got enough gas. So I think that's something we have to make sure we emphasize as instructors and leaders, mentors, and students, make sure they have enough for the planned mission.
Correct.
Regardless of what that is. So Mike, I think on that note, we've hit the hour. I really appreciate the time. Let me see if we can sneak in one more. Bear with me 1 second. Well, one gentleman asked, Eric asked, is a plane like a car more fuel efficient with less weight in the plane? Well, we're both pilots. What do you think?
Well, it's got to be, because it's going to take less energy to climb to altitude.
I agree, but again, with the planes we fly, I don't think that 1/10 of a gallon an hour is really worth it. I don't think it's a good bet.
Well, as I mentioned in the Billings to Hillsboro thing, the rationalization, it was mostly downhill and I was lightly loaded. Yeah, you can wish that, but like you say, it really doesn't make much difference. I've never done any flight planning that, I've now got more weight than before on it. The only thing I've really noticed on the when you get into the gross takeoff weight category, this is particularly on Cessna 206s, and I'm wandering off target here, is when you're getting a checkout, particularly if you haven't been in that plane before, let's say you're moving from a Skylane or 172 into a 206 or a Bonanza, load it up with buckshot, wheat, dirt, whatever you can, and get a gross weight takeoff checkout. You'll be amazed at how different the plane performs.
I will agree with that, and I'll say the same thing for the PA-32 series.
Yes, so, yeah, any of the 6-seat aircraft, correct.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess my only answer for this, for everybody, do everything as if you were gross weight, and everything, and then anything you gain is a freebie. So, yes. Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time this evening. I look forward to seeing you up at Oshkosh. Be safe. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome, and travel safe.
All right. Thank you much, everybody. We'll see you next month. Take care.
Hi, this is Bob Mader again with a couple of quick reminders to help you get the most from this program. Earn credit for this course by clicking the button on the right side of your screen that says Earn Wings Credit. This will take you to the FAAsafety.gov site to review the course content and take the mastery quiz. Remember, your input helps NAFI provide better features and benefits. And completion of the course evaluation earns a chance to win a NAFI 50th anniversary shirt. If you want to watch this program again, or view any previous Metro Live program, or share these programs with your students or friends, just go to nafinet.org to get the links. On behalf of everyone at NAFI, thanks again for watching, and safe flying.